I'm going to welcome Becky Laboon and Beverly Black, members from the I.C.E. Public Member Committee, to kick off the call.
Thank you, Katie. And thanks everybody for joining the call. Many of us are members of the Public Member Committee that meets monthly. But welcome to those of you who are new to this call. We hope you'll continue to participate. And if anybody wants to join the Public Member Committee, please let Katie know or let me know if you'd like to join us monthly as opposed to quarterly. I think there are too many people on the call for us to go around and introduce ourselves. I think it would take up too much time. So please, if you do speak, introduce yourselves before you speak, and that'll be the opportunity to let people know who you are. The agenda for this meeting is a recap of activities that occurred at the I.C.E. Exchange in Savannah, many of which were initiated by the Public Member Committee. I.C.E. is very generous and provides a lot of opportunities for the public members to gather at the exchange, and they generously waive the public members' registration fee if they attend with their CEO or board chair. So for those of you who are public members on this call who haven't participated in the exchange, I'd encourage you to ask your board to budget for your travel and housing expenses for next year, and try to get there. It's a very educational and fun experience. As I said, there are two opportunities for public members to get together at the meeting. The first, there's a breakfast on the very first day when public members gather, and then there's a debrief session at the end of the meeting. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened at the public member breakfast at the beginning of the meeting. There were 20 people in attendance, which is a really good number. And we went around the room, people introduced themselves, and they were asked to mention a burning issue that's on their minds or on the minds of their boards. And I want to briefly tell you what people said. How does my board define the public? It's public. What does the public care about? Should we be doing surveys? How do we measure how a board protects the public? Why is certification important, and how do we measure its value? Is there any empirical evidence, or how can we go about gathering empirical evidence to support the value of certification to the public? How can public members be visible? And how can public members help their boards to raise public awareness about certification? How can public members avoid being co-opted by the professional members on their boards? Are there limits to a public member's participation in board leadership? If you can't be a committee chairperson, or if you can't be an officer of your board, maybe you want to encourage them to change that limitation. How can public members use each other as resources? How can we help public members who, quote, don't feel qualified to comment? What can we do to encourage them to be active participants? Board governance and orientation and development. How can boards help public members be effective? And finally, there's a need for boards to focus on continuing competence, and public members can play a role in encouraging their boards to do that. Another thing I want to mention about what happened at the exchange is has to do with the Ben Schimberg Public Service Award, which is an award that honors someone whose career and accomplishments supports accountability and advancing the public interest in both professional licensure and private certification. These were principles that Ben Schimberg dedicated himself to, and he was also a great believer in public members and the constructive contribution that they can make to their boards. The award was created by the Citizen Advocacy Center to honor Ben Schimberg's memory. He was our first board chair. The Citizen Advocacy Center was a support program for public members in both licensing and certification. And it gave the Ben Schimberg Award at its annual meeting for a number of years. CAC has discontinued its annual meeting, and I.C.E. has generously assumed responsibility for the Schimberg Award. And this committee will have some responsibility for identifying Schimberg Award recipients. And the Schimberg Award will be part of I.C.E.'s constellation of awards that they give out every year at the exchange. And the 2022 recipient was Tom Graniter, who is the Vice President for External Relations at the American Board of Medical Specialties. And according to the plaque that he was given, he was honored for his career-long commitment to advancing public health, his appreciation for the importance of having the consumer's voice at the table, and his encouragement of public members in governance and policymaking. And in keeping with the Schimberg Award tradition, Tom will deliver an address on the subject of public service and public protection. And the occasion for that address will be our next quarter's Public Member Network Zoom call, which will be on March 14th. So I encourage you all to put that on your calendars and listen to him. I'm sure he'll be delightful and informative. He's an excellent speaker and a great wit, in addition to being a public advocate. Now I want to turn to brief reports from various members of the committee about 6 noteworthy concurrent sessions that were held at the exchange, and many of which were proposed by the Public Member Committee. I want to start with Nancy Alawalia, who chaired a session that was focused specifically on public members. Nancy?
Okay, well, thank you, Becky. And I would certainly invite Glenna Tinney and Karen Plaus and Cheryl Traficano, and I'm missing one. Wait at me. Oh, Beverly, right in front of me. Yeah, no, I had 4 table leaders, all discussing various facets of getting the best from your credentialing board public member. It's a mouthful. Anyway, we had 4 segments. One was creating a job description for a public member. The second one was identifying stakeholders for a specific profession. And this brainstorming activities for that identifying stakeholders was with the purpose of finding a public member. Then we talked about techniques and processes for recruiting and or selecting a public member. And then finally, we invited the participants at the 4 tables to talk about how to encourage public member engagement. Now, we had specific individual topics within each of the segments, and I'll just simply talk about the ones that we had for each. Under creating a job description, we talked about sources to research sample descriptions, types of expertise a public member might bring to the board, and skills required for a public member. The second segment was actually truly a brainstorming session. We had 4 different, almost random job titles, and they were the group was really good about identifying not only close public members, but people that were farther out in the field. And I'll just talk about the one, which was dog trainer. And that one included the health department, animal control. So they went pretty far reaching, and I was very pleased with the exercise. The third one, under techniques and processes for recruiting and or selecting a public member, we had steps for a nominating committee, the application process, and recruiting activities. And then in the final one, we had encouraging public member engagement. One was outlining of training and or orientation topics, opportunities to educate the board, how to deal with a board chair who does not include the public member. And then we had some general conclusions. And you'll notice I am reading from a paper that will be published at the networking center in our community on I.C.E. as soon as I get to Katie and she tells me what to do. So questions, comments? Beverly, Karen, Glenna, and Cheryl, there you are. I keep trying to find you on the screen. Sorry about that. Any other comments? Beverly, you took yourself off mute, so go.
I think, oh, you're so good. Nancy and this team put together an amazing session, but the participants were wonderful. We had so much great input. And I'll sort of add to the plug that Becky added. This is such a rich group. And I think each of us would say that we have learned so much more from the group than we have put into it. But it was a great roundtable to be part of. And I think we all learned a lot.
I have a comment. I participated in that and I really enjoyed it. And I think the format works very well. And I would encourage more of those types of sessions rather than just the lecture.
Karen, Lena, Cheryl?
I echo
Karen?
what Beverly said. Nancy, you did a tremendous job pulling us together, and it was just great to meet the variety of individuals who participated and to hear the different feedback.
I agree, certainly. I had fun doing it and I got to know the 4 team members better too. We had multiple Zoom calls and came to pretty good agreement as to how to make the session work. So it was fun. On to the next
I
one.
attended
Becky.
the session also. It was a very informative, very interactive session, and the report that Nancy and the group has produced is excellent. And it has, among other things, a section, as she said, on recruiting, which will be very helpful to the person who posed a question in advance of this session about recruiting, locating, recruiting, orienting public members. This is going to be a very helpful resource, I think. Anything else on that session? Glenna, would you talk a little bit about the DEI sessions that you attended?
Yes, I actually attended several DEI sessions. This group had proposed a DEI session on kind of the evolution of the DEI framework to include a B for belonging, but that was not accepted for the exchange for this year, but we will be looking to put that forth again next year. So the sessions I attended were all very similar in terms of the presenters were really focusing on what their organizations had been doing around DEI. So I'm just going to read through some of my notes because I think they were very similar. So one is the importance that DEI needs to be interwoven throughout the whole organization. So it's really having to do some kind of evaluation of the programs that an organization has to determine the status of how diversity, equity, and inclusion is visible, and there's a substantive part of everything that the organization is doing. So it's questions like, do the mission and vision statements address DEI? Have you examined your assessment data by demographics beyond race and ethnicity? For example, looking at household income, etc. So really looking at those subgroups in terms of the demographics for the assessment data. And has an organization collected data about challenges and barriers that the candidates and various other stakeholders may be experiencing? Has the organization conducted a DEI audit in terms of the whole organization? And there was, encouragement of getting kind of an external group to help with that audit. And looking at things like evaluating fairness and equity in 3 areas. One area is the standards and certification. Another area is mobilization, advocacy, and awareness. And the third was the candidate experience. And then also potentially doing an anti-racist DEI program audit, really looking at identifying priority areas for improvement and within the organization, identifying why is it important to even do this? You know, why does it matter? And how will the findings be used? Looking for perhaps doing surveys of stakeholders and candidates, reviewing the standards, the certification, awareness, the candidate experience, and support. And then developing partnerships. So part of this is recruiting people, you know, not only, but, you know, wanting to have a wider representation of candidates within the base, but also in expanding diversity of the board of directors. So part of that is partnering with Black, Indigenous, people of color groups, and other interested parties. Looking at standards revision in terms of, you know, with a lens to DEI, providing guidance for accomplished practice in fairness, and pilot adapted revision of protocols for theme-based revisions. Looking at resources, having resources in different languages, like webinars potentially in Spanish or other languages. Looking at test development, who's developing the test? Is there diversity and representation in the people who are developing the test? Same as question, who's reviewing the test? Selection of committee members, who is scoring and wanting to make sure that there's diversity and representation in those personnel as well. And then the recruitment goals and increasing engagement, really trying to ensure that there is more diversity and representation in all aspects of what the organization is doing. Reviewing of training materials, wanting to address whether there's bias in the materials. I did attend a session on looking for bias in test items. It was not defined as a DEI session, but it was still very interesting. And so I think, you know, having external subject matter experts that are also diverse. So it's really, this session really kind of summarized a lot of areas that I think are important in terms of an organization's consideration around DEI. I do think one person that I know was telling me about an experience that they had in a conversation with someone from one of the organizations that organization had been doing a lot of work, some of these, you know, trying to incorporate DEI kind of components into their program. That particular program had high representation of the LGBTQ plus community, but their experience didn't go well. So their experience was that they really were trying to be sensitive and trying to incorporate a lot of inclusion and diversity and equity related to that group, but they ended up irritating everybody. So apparently the subject group, the marginalized group that they were attempting to be more inclusive, felt like they didn't go far enough. And the other members of the group felt like they went too far and were questioning, why did they even bring this up and why were they even involved in this, which goes back to the why for the organization. So what happened was they ended up losing people that were no longer wanting to be involved, in the professional organization for that particular profession lost members to the point where they had to cancel their annual conference. So I just it's a little bit of a cautionary tale, because, you know, DEI is like very visible right now, as it should be, and it is an important area that I think organizations need to consider. But I think it's important that the organizations also realize that they might need help with this, that this is maybe not something they are experts on, and maybe just jumping into it without really considering all the implications and potential consequences, without perhaps having a really well thought out process and plan, can have very significant unintended consequences. So now, and I don't know what their process was because that conversation was secondhand, but I do know that, I was thinking I wanted to bring this up more within my own organization about having a committee and, how we might want to proceed. But I decided I first need to step back before I move forward on this. I need to talk with some experts in this area, and pick their brain a little bit, before I start moving forward with trying to make recommendations, because I'm not an expert on DEI. I'm a social worker. That's my background. And I've been, I've worked in this area a lot, but I haven't done particular DEI work. So, and I forgot to mention that I'm the public member for the National Board for Respiratory Care. So the sessions were good. I do want to also say that one of the sessions that I attended, however, this organization was talking about all the DEI work they had been doing, but the two people speaking were both Caucasian women. So that, I had a question mark in my mind about that. If you had been proceeding doing DEI work, I would think you would have had a better representation in terms of people that would have been presenting the work that you were doing. Now, maybe is my own bias, and I'll own it, but it was a question in my mind. So anyway, I think that gives you a flavor. There were other sessions, but they were all very similar in terms of what their own experiences were within the organizations. But I'll be glad to address any questions, anybody or anything anybody wants to add to that. Catherine?
Yeah, Glenna, first of all, thank you very much. That was a terrific summary. And I attended some of the sessions, but not all of them. And I really appreciate your summary and your takeaway points. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to include some of that information that was presented in a package format for or whatever on the public member page, with maybe links to some of that information, because I do think that it oftentimes the public members are asked about this. I'm just going to say that the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and so it'd be nice to have access to some of the takeaways that you saw or heard at the sessions, and maybe we could start putting together some information. And I think I.C.E. has some information as well, but maybe the public member site could link to that. So anyway, I just want to make more connections, because I think this issue does come up regularly, and it'd be good for all of us to have access to as much information as we can, especially to the expert information, not just the opinion pieces. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other comments on this, or we'll turn to another session? Grady, are you time limited? Are you going to be able to stay on the call?
I think I'm fine, unless otherwise noted. Do you want me to go ahead?
I guess so. You're a little muffled.
Okay.
Grady is speaking from, can I tell people?
Sure.
Speaking from a waiting room in a hospital. So
Here.
thank you for joining the call. Grady led a very interesting session on longitudinal assessment.
Yeah. Let me stop my video and see if that, do I sound a little better now?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was a great session. We had a session that was focusing on longitudinal assessment, but from the perspective of public protection. Specifically, how does longitudinal assessment recertification process protect the public? And so we compared 3 different programs. We're trying to get across the idea it's not just the National Board of Medical Specialties that do this, although they certainly are the prime movers, and they have most of the examples and deserve credit. I'm glad that Tom got the award he did for moving in that direction, because I think it's one of the most significant things we've done for public protection in a long while. But we did want to advance the notion that it's more than just ABMS boards. The physician assistants were represented. They had a pilot program for longitudinal assessment, as well as National Board for Respiratory Care. Both have programs, and so we asked all 3 programs. We wanted to compare the programs and wanted to ask questions that sort of centered around public protection as an issue. So in comparing those questions, for example, we would ask, Must the certificates use longitudinal assessment, or is there an alternative? That was an interesting comparison. We asked the question of how they established the passing standards, trying to look to see how well that process was aligned with public protection. We also asked the question, when a participant performs at a low level on longitudinal assessment, can that directly lead to credential loss? And that's kind of an important question. We're interested in seeing programs that are there for a reason, for lack of a better term. In other words, not just a casual participation, but something that matters. In other words, if you have loss of a credential as a possibility in your program, then people, we think, will take that seriously. And so it was interesting to compare the programs on that score. We also asked the question of how long poor performers can remain in remediation or can remain certified. And is that information available to the public, which is interesting to find out. Once you have some sort of indication as to somebody's knowledge level dropping below a certain level, how long do you leave them in the program? How long do you allow them to continue to be certified? Very difficult issue. But it was interesting to see a comparison of programs along those lines. And another incentive question: if a participant performs at a high level on longitudinal assessments, may documentation of other learning activities be relaxed or excused? In other words, if you perform well on the longitudinal assessment, can you exempt requirements for certain continuing education? And some programs allowed that, others did not. But it kind of makes sense, and it's a carrot stick approach. The carrot being, if you get out of having to go spend money to attend continuing education, then that's a good thing. And also, if you can demonstrate you have the knowledge that's being required, maybe you don't need to go to that CE course. So that kind of works well to provide some incentive for participation. We also asked questions about the program providing a way to individualize content. This helps better reflect practitioners' specific needs or specialization, which happens in a lot of areas. And some of the programs had some very significant tailoring of content. Others felt like, everybody needs the same content, so you shouldn't individualize it. And sometimes those answers depend on how narrow or broad the particular credential is. Some credentials are, if they're specialty credentials in particular, they can be very narrow in focus, and maybe that's not an issue. Broader credentials like physician assistant, for example, have a number of different areas you can specialize in, and it sometimes makes sense to focus more on those needs. So those were the kind of questions we had. We addressed those questions with each of the three programs, and then we had some great audience interaction. So I think they left with a greater understanding of what longitudinal assessment is, but also we helped direct the focus onto what about those programs is useful in terms of helping to protect the program, the public, and which questions the board member, for example, might ask of those programs if they're considering maybe a longitudinal assessment program. At the end of the day, our job is to protect the public, and so we'd like to have evidence-supported approaches for doing that. And I think longitudinal assessment is a great way to do that, and kind of get away from just the CE tracker only models that with conventional CE, not to say all CE, but that conventional CE is not shown to have a great deal of efficacy in terms of practitioner changes or healthcare outcomes. So we're looking to do more, and it's great to have new tools to do that. And so I think we had a good session. And can I answer any questions about that? All right.
I have a question. How many of the people on the call, how many of your organizations are considering longitudinal assessment as part of their recertification program? I know that the nurse anesthetist board that I'm serving on is conducting a pilot. I see 1, 2, 3. hands.
Mhm.
I wonder if this is something that public members ought to bring to suggest to their boards that they consider doing this. I get the impression that it's of all the recertification formulas, it tends to be pretty popular with the certificants as opposed to some of the other requirements.
Becky, one issue we ran into, I'm sorry, Elsie Kelly, I'm with the International Board of Heart Rhythm Examiners. And we went from a 10-year test to 3-year tests using current periodicals and new information that came along from which to draw the test test questions. We ran into a problem in that, and I don't know which board it is because I can't remember the name of it, questioned whether we were in the business of education, because they said we're not supposed to be educating, we're just supposed to be certifying knowledge. And that was kind of a little bit of a stumbling block for us, because we definitely want to test current information rather than what was in vogue 10 years ago. So I think the clients, the doctors and the people that were testing, all of the, I mean, all the way down to the well, mostly this was for doctors, I think, like it because they don't like that big 10-year test. But we did have that issue.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Elsie. That's a great question and a great issue because, traditionally we've had separation of church and state, with the association owning the education process and certifying body having just the exam. This gets into a really tricky area because one of the things we see in the research is that test-enhanced learning is much more efficient at acquiring knowledge, and in terms of the durability of that knowledge, you just learn better if you're going to take a test on it, and it's very well established. So I think we're going to see a blending of those issues because you're exactly right. We have this what some psychometricians would call an unholy alliance of formative and summative in these programs. So you are both teaching and testing. Just the simple process of taking one question at a time, providing, the information of whether you got that right or wrong, and then providing the critiques or rationales for why each choice is right or wrong. That in itself is extremely educational, but you can sort of see where that marriage of those two approaches is beneficial. So I think we're going to continue to have that debate.
Grady, if you, I'm looking at the time and want to get to other reports. Can you stay on the call to mention your I.C.E idea later on?
Sure.
Okay. Next, I'd like to turn to Catherine and Zeno, who both attended a session on with a presentation about codes of ethics, essentially, where we had speakers from the, well, go ahead, Catherine, you start and explain the session.
Sure, thank you. Are you okay, Zena, if I go ahead?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
Please jump in. I'll set the groundwork. Yeah, it was a session called, it was a long title, but it's important. State legislation that would constrain enforcement of conduct codes and eligibility requirements by licensing boards and certification programs. So they tried to cover a lot, but basically, as Becky introduced, it was talking about concern over state legislation that might limit licensing boards and certification bodies' ability to restrict eligibility into their respective programs. In particular, and it was presented by two expert speakers. These two were awesome. Julia Judish and Tom Granitor, whose name you've already heard a couple times today, did the presentation. Julia's from, she was representing the PCC, which is the Professional Certification Coalition, to which I.C.E. is a member and one of the leaders. And Tom was representing the American Board of Medical Specialties. In particular, Julia was focused on recent spate of legislation across the states on ex-offender reentry bills. So this is all about trying states who are considering limiting state boards in their use of past criminal activity to restrict people from the licensed professions. So some states are saying we need to open this up a little bit more. The state boards have been too restrictive and subjective. And of course, there's been pushback on that. And Julia was talking quite a bit about there's a balancing act. So you want to, protect the public from bad actors while making sure that you're providing an opportunity to potential strong and qualified people into the profession. In particular, the PCC has pushed back against some of the legislation, especially some of the clean slate. That's one of the terms of art that's being used, clean slate legislation, which would essentially, wipe the slate clean for an ex-offender after a certain number of years, or if it was a certain type of offense. And Julia was speaking about the importance for credentialing entities especially, and she made a strong distinction between credentialing agencies, which are private sector, and state boards, which are government actors. But she was making the point that private sector credentialing agencies have the opportunity to discriminate essentially because they want to be exclusive, not to discriminate unfairly, but they want to be exclusive and make sure they have people who are competent, not going to be unsafe to the public. So that's what the presentation was about from her perspective. And then Tom talked a lot about the American Board of Medical Specialties and the rising importance of professionalism, and mentioned again some of the things that you've all heard in the news about challenges to the medical profession, regulation, especially around some of the boards wanted to discipline physicians who had been providing disinformation and misinformation about COVID. So this is an issue that came up over the past couple of years. And then there was pushback from the other side saying, this is a freedom of speech issue, First Amendment. So there's a lot of controversy. These were very hot topics, very controversial topics. I will add my little 2 cents editorial comment that in particular, as we put on that hat of a public member who not only represents the patients, clients, the general public being served by the licensed and credentialed professionals, but also people who would go into these professions. That's another big chunk of the public that we're representing. I think it's really important to keep in mind the potential discrimination that some of the boards, whether it's licensing boards or certification boards, are doing through use of looking at criminal records, because sometimes criminal records do serve as a proxy for race. We know that in the literature. And also some of the certification bodies, even though they're private, they're relied on by the public sector or the government sector licensing boards sometimes. So there's a close connection there. They're not easily distinguished. So I just think it's really important. It's very nuanced. It's very complex. It's emotionally charged. I think these two did a terrific job. I think it's a a couple topics here that we as public members should be keeping an eye on, a really close eye, and having some tough conversations about, because there's not easy answers, and it will bring up some emotions, but it's really important. And I'm glad that they did the session. I hope these conversations continue. Let me turn this over to you, Zeno.
Okay, thank you. I think you did a wonderful job of summarizing the session. And I'll just add a couple of things by way of background. On the PCC, the Professional Certification Coalition, is led by the Pillsbury Group law firm out of Washington, D.C., and Julia Judish, who presented, is a member of that firm. The PCC's activities are funded by a lot of the associations and organizations, perhaps even some of your organizations are funders of the PCC effort. And what they do is monitor activities and events taking place at the federal level, at the state level, that could impact the licensing and and certification efforts of organizations like ours, activities that could restrict our ability to do our jobs and protect the public. Also, by way of background, for the last maybe 4 or 5 years, perhaps a little bit longer than that, there has been at least one session provided during the I.C.E. exchange that provides the attendees with an update on the legislative landscape, whether it's at the federal level or the state level or both, just to keep folks apprised of what is happening across the country. Oftentimes, something may start legislatively in one part of the country and wind up making its way across the rest of the country. Certainly, with these clean slate laws that Catherine just referenced, that certainly has happened. I'll mention one other real life example that was given. Many of you may be familiar with the Stop Woke Act in Florida that restricts the ability of folks to use certification and licensing bodies, restricts their ability to require certain things like DEI training or other matters under the auspices of violating free speech rights. And as Catherine mentioned, there have been many instances, including down in Florida, where some health officials have really passed along misinformation, certainly unproven, non-scientific information about COVID, and yet acts like the Stop Woke Act prevents regulatory bodies from being able to take any action against that individual's license. So while the Stop Woke Act down in Florida right now has been, I guess, ruled unconstitutional, or as a temporary hold has been put on implementation of that act by the courts in Florida. It still remains to see what's going to happen in the final outcome with that law. I certainly was taken aback, particularly being in healthcare, being in public health, taken aback by some of the misstatements that were made by physicians and other health personnel across the country, and was astounded that bodies like ABMS and other state licensing boards were limited in the type of action that they may have even wanted to take against some of those providers giving out that misinformation. And it certainly is a concern to many public health advocates across the country. I'll stop there and say that in addition to serving on this public member committee, I also serve as the public member representative to I.C.E.'s exchange program committee, and I also serve as a public member on the Commission on Certification of Physician Assistants, along with Beverly. And we'll be happy to take any questions at the appropriate time.
We have 2 more sessions to describe, in addition to a couple of other things I'd like to cover, and we only have 10 minutes until the hour expires. Maybe some of you can stay a little bit longer, but let me turn to Mike. Can you give us a little bit of an update on a session on governance that you attended?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. And I'll be brief. And the reason I'll be brief is because I believe you can request a copy of the complete survey report conducted by Seacrest. I know they made it publicly available on LinkedIn earlier in November. And I would encourage you to reach out to them. Their website is seacrustcompany.com, and their email address is info@seacrustcompany.com. They have done a survey periodically off and on going back to 2008. The most recent version was in 2022, and they survey more than 60 plus certification bodies. And they asked a variety of questions regarding attributes for organizational profile, the composition of the certification board, if you have a public member, if you don't, are you currently accredited, what level of autonomy and decision-making you have, the level of organization and training that's provided, how do you conduct your meetings, specific responsibilities of the governing board, such as are you responsible for determining fees or responsibility for marketing. And what was most interesting was they also summarized the top challenges, and they shared the change of these top challenges going back to the very first version of the survey they did in 2008. And for 2022, the two that they called out specifically are developing a pipeline of qualified certification governing board members, and then also the costs of ongoing exam development and maintenance. And they partially attribute the appearance of both of those new challenges as part of their 2022 survey, perhaps as a result of COVID that has impacted all certification bodies. But it's a great report. It was a great presentation. It's about 30 plus pages, and they do go into detail on the benchmarks they collected for all of the various categories that I described earlier. And I strongly encourage you to reach out to Seacrest and see if they'd be willing to share the full report with you.
Thank you, Mike. The last session that I want to report on is the session that I was the moderator of, and it was called Hard Facts About Soft Skills. And the focus of the session was assessing performance. And it was an idea that was generated by the Public Member Committee, because as representatives of consumers and patients and clients, we care about how people perform as much as we care about their book learning, which is far easier to test than performance. There were 3 psychometricians, one John Weiner, who was on the call a few minutes. He apparently just left the call. I was going to give him an opportunity to chime in. 3 psychometricians talked about current trends, the use of performance testing, and speculated a little bit about what to anticipate in the future. We were chastised a little bit for using the term soft skills and non-cognitive competence, because on the grounds that might minimize the significance of the kinds of things we're talking about, which are behavioral and human relations, communication, things like that really are very important to performance. So the terminology is probably going to need to change. They talked about the growing science of defining competence, and they talked about the need to modify practice analysis accordingly if we're talking about competencies instead of knowledge and skills. They talked about the techniques for assessing competencies, such as simulations, assessing situational judgment, focusing on fundamental transferable skills, and workplace. And they also agreed that next year we will repropose this kind of session, and with a focus on continuing competence as opposed to assessing for initial certification, and talk about things such as workplace monitoring, chart review, 360-degree evaluation, and other techniques, again focusing on ongoing assessment and continuing competence. And this is a nice segue back to Grady, who wants to mention briefly his idea for a project that he's hoping organizations might take up related to continuing competence and more meaningful ways of assessing it. Grady, quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief. This this is an initiative coming from the public member committee, but the notion is that we would like to raise awareness and raise focus on continuing competence. And so the idea is that we would create an organization that would be called the International Society for the Advancement of Continuing Competence, or I.C.E. Been talking with Becky, and we've been talking with Denise Rosendahl and Adam Parfit of CLEAR. And Denise has suggested that we need to incorporate this as a more freestanding coalition approach, much more like PCC. So this could be a freestanding organization could interface with other groups like CLEAR, I.C.E., FARB, or Association of Test Publishers, ATP, other groups where we could interface with those groups and try and incentivize development of more relevant and evidence-enhanced, evidence-supported approaches to continuing competence. In other words, look for things, approaches that are seen to be effective, and try and incentivize those. We have 3 phases identified so far. The first phase would be the easy phase, where we would simply provide awards. We would interface with other organizations and their awards programs, and then provide awards for those programs we feel are in alignment with our mission and values. So that's ongoing. We've talked with Julia Judish that Zeno had mentioned, who has provided some helpful legal advice, and we're in ongoing discussions with Adam Parfit at CLEAR, and stay tuned for further developments.
Thank you, Grady. At the end of the exchange, as I said, the public members gathered together again and talked about topics that they would like to propose for next year's exchange. And the ideas that surfaced at that session include a follow-up on performance testing, as I said, with a focus on recertification, an overview of the emerging arena of micro-credentials, and we thought that it might be positioned as a public members' questions and concerns about micro-credentials. We talked about something about team practice, perhaps finding a way to certify teams, perhaps examining the potential for certifying organizations to work together with cross-training and cross-credentialing the multiple professions that work in settings such as hospice, operating rooms, other areas of inpatient care, financial planning, engineering, those areas where professions work together as teams. How do we address the credentialing issues presented by that? A follow-up on DEI, and Glenna is going to repropose what she proposed this past year, adding the concept of belonging to the DEI lexicon. The status of research to demonstrate the value of certification. I'm talking beyond the value to the certificates themselves. We know quite a bit about that. They get increased pay, they get self-esteem, status, pride. We want to know what are the impacts of certification on outcomes, on quality, and is there a way of demonstrating that, and what kind of research is underway, and what kind of evidence is it generating? Board governance. We've talked about developing a survey, and Nancy is very much involved in this, and it may build on what Seacrest has done. A survey of governance, again, but with a focus on public members and how do governance structures facilitate the participation by public members. I'm thinking, Zeno reminds me we might propose again a session on a legislative update, what's happening around the country that affects certification and that affects public members in particular. And for those of, if anybody on the call has an additional suggestion for topics that we might propose for next year, we'd love to hear it either now or subsequent to the call. You can communicate with either Katie or me or anybody else on the call. But if you have a suggestion for an idea that we might develop into a proposal for a session. nobody has an idea right now, I guess. And then I have a couple of announcements I'd like to get in. It is 11 o'clock, but if you can stay for another minute or two. On January 25th, I.C.E. is going to be sponsoring a webinar on the identification and nurturing of public members. And it's being sponsored by I.C.E.'s Education Committee, and there will be two speakers. I'm one of them, and the other one is Tara Montgomery, who is a public member of the Board of Directors of the American Board of Medical Specialties and a very impressive person. Our future network calls, as I said earlier, on March 14th, we will have the Schimberg address by Tom Graniter. So please put that on your calendars. June 13th, we're going to do something on DEI. Glenna's going to arrange that presentation. On September 11th, we've talked about developing a session on ideas for how certifying bodies can identify with their stakeholders and connect with them, including consumers and the general public. And we don't yet have a definite plan for our December 11th network call, and we are open to suggestions and ideas from any of you. And if anybody has any comments or questions to conclude the session, yes, Glenna?
What time is the January 25th webinar?
I don't remember. Let me look. Nine a.m. Pacific,
So noon Eastern.
noon Eastern. I think that's correct.
Hmm.
Katie, do you know offhand?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific.
Thank you.
And it would be great to have any or all of you to participate, and if there'll undoubtedly be a Q&A portion to that. And it'd be wonderful to have you chime in. Do we have any other comments by anybody, or? Well, thank you all. Thank everybody for participating.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Here.
meeting, everyone.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.